All right. Good morning, everybody. Let me call this meeting to order for the purpose of discussing the Black Mountain Library situation and also stormwater planning and presentation. So with that, we're going to start with the library. So who's going to lead that discussion? You going to start that, Ron?
I can take that if you'd like. I emailed out a large amount of material, and I don't know if everybody got it or not, but it's from the county attorney's office. I just asked for everything they had, and they were fairly generous. I read through some of it. There were, in the questionnaires that were answered, it struck me that some of the questions may have been loaded or omitted so that they didn't have answers, or they chose not to give them. And it looked to me like our library got slightly misrepresented as condition and programs. But the library board met the other night, and we're going to hopefully meet with the director next month. I think Pam has met with the director, and she may have some information here. But what you have in front of you is a resolution Savannah put together, picked up some other things, sort of beefed it up from discussion from the library board, because they thought the things I added to hers were, one is, sustainability. Is it in keeping with the concept of sustainability, take a perfectly good building and replace it with another building down the street? And our idea of having a walkable community when you move your library 2.5 miles from downtown just sort of beefed up the resolution that's in front of you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Pam, would you like to?
I have a few points I'd like to share. I did meet with the Buncombe County Library Director, Jim Blanton, and was able to ask him questions, and I thought there were a few points you all might find interesting. Not to be alarmed, this is 14-point font. I'm not planning to be here all day with this, but so I just start by saying that it's real obvious that many of us love the Black Mountain Library, and it's really important that we watch the county commission meeting on Tuesday, the 18th at 5 p.m. That's when this whole consultant's report is going to be presented, and the discussion that will follow. And I think that would be really helpful for all of us to understand, what the plans are going to be. Just to give you a little context of where this came from, the county launched a process some months ago to evaluate. Would you mind if I took this off for just a minute?
No, go right ahead.
The county launched a process some months ago to evaluate the best use of all county-owned buildings and leased buildings, including the library buildings. That's 43 buildings. The Buncombe County libraries have been on the back burner for some years, and compared to peer counties, we're behind on facilities, staffing, and salaries. It's a good thing that the current county commission is looking at all of that. And last year they added 8 long overdue positions to the county library system, for staffing. The consultant analysis of data came to the conclusion that the Swannanoa Valley would be better served by a larger multifunctional facility. Their focus was completely on data, because that's what consultants do, largely. And it's to be used as a starting point for the discussion. Every library in our county is up for similar review on a multi-year timeline with the goal of creating an outstanding library system for the county. Many factors need to be considered, including efficient use of tax dollars for staffing, etc. Just to be clear here, the current Buncombe County Library Director, Jim Blanton, is not driving the idea to close the Black Mountain Library. He's part of the county commission discussion, along with the public going forward. And as he put it to me, he said, if it was up to me, we'd have a library on every street corner. So there's a lot to consider, a lot of factors. I would reiterate that it's important that we watch this presentation before you make decisions and come to conclusions. Sometimes it's just good to hear all the points of view, even if you don't agree with them. Jim did share with me that elsewhere, exceptions have been made to consultant reports and so on regarding libraries. If a community can convince the decision makers that that library is a community anchor, and sometimes that can override the sheer data of it. If you can convince them that it's a community anchor and that moving it would be a significant loss to the community. He did point out, though, that if we chose to make that argument and were successful, that probably the county would require significant expansion and upgrades to the current Black Mountain Library to help it meet best use standards for libraries these days, more square footage and so on. So those are the highlights of what I heard from Jim. I just wanted to share with you where this came from, because to me it felt like it was out of the clear blue sky and like, what? It was a shock, but it's been in the process for quite some time and is far from decided. That's this presentation on Tuesday is really just the beginning point of the discussion. And it's, if you read that report, you might come to the same conclusion too. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. Let's just build a bigger one in the middle and close these two little ones. But as we know, the decision is not all based on data. I did find information on how the public can provide input to Tuesday's meeting. There's a fairly complicated process. You can be in person, you can send letters, whatever. I posted it on my council member Facebook page yesterday, but I think it might be helpful if I emailed it to all of you after this. So if the public inquires as to how they can provide input to the county commission meeting, we can tell them. That's kind of it, short and sweet. If I could answer questions, I'll try, but I just wanted to share what points I had gleaned from my meeting with Jim.
Well, it's my thinking that this resolution is good feedback for the county commissioners. So, I think it's succinct. Like, if I could, let me read this for anybody who might be listening or watching. Resolution of opposition to Buncombe County Library Facility Master Plan. Whereas the Buncombe County Board of Commissioners will be considering the Buncombe County Library Facility Plan, which proposes that the Black Mountain Library close and be relocated, and whereas the town of Black Mountain recognizes the Black Mountain Library as a vital community anchor, and whereas the Black Mountain Library provides direct and indirect support of the citizens of Black Mountain who are working to improve their lives through literacy, citizenship, lifelong learning, career and job preparation or advancement, and whereas the physical space of the library communicates to the public our underlying values that libraries, information, and shared community space are significant, and whereas the central location of the Black Mountain Library in the town supports the promoted concept of a walkable community, and whereas while the layout of the interior of the Black Mountain Library building might benefit from changes to better fit the ways libraries are used in the 21st century, the building is in good physical condition with no need for any major repairs. And whereas the concept of sustainability will be better served by continued use of the present Black Mountain Library building, which can be updated where needed for a fraction of the cost of construction and use of materials that will be required to build a new structure. Now therefore be it resolved that the Town Council of the Town of Black Mountain is opposed to the Black Mountain County Library Facility Master Plan as it is currently written, and urges the Buncombe County Commissioners to vote against the plan. And if the board so chooses, adopted this day, this 13th day of May 2021. And so I'd offer that to the council for your consideration this morning.
Mr. Mayor, I'd move to adopt resolution R2109 as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. Is there any discussion on that? Anybody would like to make any comments before we vote? If not, go right ahead.
Ryan Stone, aye. Arch Mantillo, aye.
Tim Raines, aye.
Doug Hay, aye.
Pam King, aye.
Thank you. And Pam, thank you for your,
Yeah.
taking the lead in your work on the committee and so forth. We
Just one
appreciate
more
that.
thing I should mention for the public. There will be no vote or decision made on this meeting, at the meeting on Tuesday. It's for input, and there will be a long period of public input time available. So this decision's not imminent.
So, Savannah, would you see that this gets transmitted to the commissioners with, just with we appreciate their consideration and understanding the council's concern. It's great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And then, on to stormwater.
I'll start.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
So I think this has been a long time coming. We've talked about this for a long time. I think, when we had our audit from the state, I think that really is pushing us now to do more with our stormwater program.
Hey, Josh, would you remind me and everyone else about the audit that you're referring to?
Sure, it's. I think you're going to see that in the presentation,
Oh, okay.
the audit specifically. But it is mandatory that the state does audit anybody that holds an MPDS permit in North Carolina, and they've started doing that, I guess, more regularly as of probably last year. I think in the past it's been more of a lackadaisical approach, and it really wasn't something that was being enforced like it should have been enforced from the state. And the federal government has now, advised the state that this needs to be something that is, on the front burner and starting to be enforced. So that's what you're going to see in this presentation. Jessica has spent a considerable amount of time on this presentation, and I think it is going to be very thorough. And I think you're going to get a good idea of kind of where we started and where we at least where staff thinks we need to be ending up. So, Jessica, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Josh. So we're going to be discussing a stormwater utility and all the conditions that lead up to that. It is a lot of information. I've tried to break it down into sections to keep it manageable. Please feel free to ask me questions. I've been sitting and working on this for a long time, and I want to make sure I don't gloss over anything unintentionally. So we want to start with what this permit is. It stands for the National Pollution Discharge and Elimination System. And these permits require the implementation of a comprehensive stormwater management program that has to reduce pollution and stormwater runoff to the maximum extent possible. You'll hear that phrase a lot when you read the permit. And it's based upon 6 minimum control measures that apply throughout the jurisdiction of the MS4. And those are public education and outreach, public involvement and participation, illicit discharge detection and elimination, construction site runoff controls, post-construction site runoff controls, and pollution prevention and good housekeeping of municipal operations. So the next question is always, what is an MS4? It's Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. And so this is the conveyance of stormwater to the river, whether it gets there through an open channel ditch or a culvert and a pipe, anything working its way down there, conveying that water. Why are we one of these communities? The following criteria is issued by the EPA and is considered the determination for MS4 status and into sensitive waters. And so you have population density, growth or growth potential, your relationship to other urbanized areas, significant contributor of pollution to waters of the United States, and protection of water quality concerns by other programs. And so you can read the note down there about urbanized areas and how that's defined by the census tract with populations of greater than 50,000 people. along with adjacent territory containing non-residential urban lands used as territory with low population density. In short, this is why you can't opt out of being an MS4. It's not something that we signed up for. It is an unfunded federal mandate based on development. Stormwater is a growing concern. I picked August 2017 because that's when I started with the town. In that amount of time, there's been 1 200-year storm, 2 100-year storms, 3 50-year storms, 3 25-year storms, 17 10-year, 15 5-year rain events. That's a lot of rain, and it's got to go somewhere. Over the next 30 to 50 years, precipitation in this part of the country is anticipated to increase 5 to 10%, particularly in the winter and spring months, and those are models from NOAA. Our stormwater infrastructure is undersized and aging. So that is concerning given these statistics. And stormwater runoff is now the #1 source of surface water pollution in the United States. We have 40 years of regulatory conditions that impact stormwater, starting with EPA in 1970 and up until 2020 when we were audited and found a notice of violation. I want to point out that some of the bigger acts in here that we're concerned about is the 1972 Clean Water Act, which establishes the NPDES permit, and that much of our stormwater regulations relate to water quality and protecting quality of water. So it's about how clean the water is, not necessarily concerned about the things that we think of as stormwater in the day-to-day, which it might be localized flooding and things of that nature. So here's some details on this. We had our audit in February of 2020, and it didn't go well. We were found notice of violation, and we were put through our paces like every other town. I think there are only 2 or 3 who have passed their audits, and so we had to submit a written response. We did that. We did our self-audit. We did that, and I submitted our 3rd draft of the stormwater management plan, which is available for you to thumb through when you will get later as a PDF in your email. They will approve that, and that will be our new permit. When they approve that, I will submit the permit application, which is already ready to go, and that becomes the new permit. We learned in our audit process that general industrial permits are required. And that is for the public works facility and the public safety facility. Those permits have been applied for, but the state has not yet issued them. Those are sub-permits to the NPDES permit.
Who do you submit all this stuff to? Does it go to a state agent?
It goes to the state. Compliance and penalties. We discussed these briefly after our audit, in which you all had to do a resolution of support of the program. So NPDES permits are subject to federal and state compliance enforcement actions. Compliance with the requirements of a state-issued notice of deficiency or notice of violation have civil penalties. And if you are issued a civil penalty, that does not mean federal penalties cannot also be assessed. Under state law, a daily civil penalty of not more than $25,000 per violation may be assessed against any person who fails to act in accordance with the requirements of the permit. And under federal law, a daily civil penalty of not more than $37,500 per violation may be assessed of any person who violates the permit conditions. So the financial liability to not fulfilling the requirements of your permit are significant. And funding is required for program compliance. This is taken straight out of the NPDES permit, and where the permittee shall implement, manage, and oversee all provisions of its approved stormwater management plan to control to the maximum extent practical the discharge of pollutants associated with stormwater runoff and illicit discharges, including spills, illegal dumping from the MS4. It's included, but not limited to, the following areas. The permittee shall maintain adequate funding and staffing to implement and manage the provision of the SWMP to meet all requirements of this permit. So one thing this makes a good example of is when you look through the permit or the stormwater management plan that becomes the permit now. It's a concise, 45 pages or something. And in it, there are many line items. And some of those line items are very easy to tackle. Maintaining a stormwater hotline. Hot water. We might be in hot water if we don't get it together. That the other might be something like manage and maintain the condition of your entire MS4 system. Well, that represents millions of dollars, where one represents, a daily checking of your voicemail. So the amount of time and commitment can be very large for just one item in the permit. This is the map of our the known MS4 system. This represents 537 inlets and 138 outfalls. We do have some information about all the inlets and outfalls, including size and location, but we do not have all of the conditions cataloged. And some of the information we have is a little old. We do not have map and assessment of our surface conveyance of our open ditching, which is our primary method of moving water to these inlets.
Let me ask a question. Is an outfall, does that hits the Stormwater River?
Or a
what's the
trib
outfall?
or a ditch getting there.
Okay.
Mhm. And I will tell you a very quick funny story from our audit where he said, please take me to one of your major outfalls. And I took him down at the post office when it was raining. And I said, here's an outfall, and a fish swim out of it. And he said to me, what we here have is a surface water of the state, ma'am, that you were discharging into. And I was like, okay. So, we have interesting hydraulic conditions here in the mountains. And I think that in the future, asset mapping is going to be really critical in helping us understand what we're working with. But that's the starting point of our asset inventory. This is a map of post-construction SCMs. There are, and a few more have been added since I originally did this map, but we have about 60 stormwater controls in town on private property that resulted from stormwater permits, and that's been from the last 10 years or so. But we have to manage all of those, and everybody has to report on those every year, and there's annual compliance associated with those.
Give me an example of an SCM on private, that's been installed on private property.
It is often something very simple like a berm or a swale directing water away from the house and into the ditch. It can be a little bit more elaborate. It can be a rain garden, but it's often very small scale because the amount of water they're dealing with is typically very small.
Yeah. So how did you, about these 60, how did you identify those?
Because we permit them and we review
Just with the
compliance.
permit.
And we are required as part of our permit to maintain a map and have annual inspections of those, all of those SCMs, so that they are functioning properly and maintained in working order. We also have some of our own. We currently have 6 that are installed on town property, and they come from the Upper Swananoa Watershed Management Plan. And we are interested in expanding the number of those in the future, potentially working with private owners for easements to have, being able to install those and maintain those for collective effort. We have had those inspected in 2020. The next time I have these inspected, they will be put on a maintenance schedule and a tiered inspection schedule. So those that are most likely to take on damage in high water events get inspected every year, where those that are less susceptible will probably be every 3 years.
The amount of supervision this must take at the state level is incredible. What kind of, they just have a huge staff, how do they manage it?
I don't know how many people there are in
Crazy.
the
This,
program.
is it Diener?
DEQ.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, but they change names about every 2
It
years.
used to be that, it
I
used
think
to
it
be,
probably used to be Neener now.
yeah, well, that's usually, that makes sense.
It's under Diener.
You know, I would say just judging by the amount of time it takes them to respond to us and get back to us on certain things, they probably are understaffed as
Oh,
well.
you'd have to
Yes.
think they are, this is a massive amount of work, it's crazy.
So locally, we have regulations too to help with stormwater that are associated with our permit that we report on. But it's the Phase 2 post-construction ordinance, illicit discharge and connection, flood protection, flood hazard, and sedimentation and erosion control, which is implemented by the county on our behalf. It's typically larger projects and active construction projects. We did learn in our audit that our measures around like pet waste and accumulation are not legally sufficient. We have not figured out why, but that's our next question on our ordinances to update, is fecal chloroform mitigation. So before we started this conversation, in earnest, we knew that we wanted to get some feedback from the community. And so we did reach out and conducted 2 surveys. And the first one was about general stormwater awareness, and there are copies of both of these surveys circulating, so you can look at those. We will also email those to you. We had 93 participants respond. It indicated that participants had a reasonable understanding of where their stormwater comes from and where it's going, but weak awareness and understanding of stormwater programming by the town. And that the survey showed that localized flooding is experienced from failures of the actual MS4 system, and that's something that we're trying to gain understanding of. A lot of people reported culverts from the right-of-way causing problems on their property, or concerned that that was the source. We have not verified that. And the second survey was related to stormwater service and fees. We had 380 participants, and overall the participants expressed interest in improved stormwater services, and support for a utility fee was divided almost evenly, a third across the board. Some were willing, nobody, 1/3 did not want to pay, 1/3 was willing to pay something, and 1/3 was willing to pay. So a maybe, a yes, and a no group. About our service, we had 30% at poor, 22% at very poor, 27% at average, then the top tier, and then 10% said they didn't know. There's that breakdown of willingness to pay. It's no and maybe. And here are the amounts, and I'm sorry if that might be a little difficult to read, but this illustrates the potential fee structures that we'll look at later on. So, 27% didn't want to pay anything. Almost 34% said $24 a year, 13% at $36, 10% at $48, and then we have smaller groups for 60, 72, and more than 72. So what is a stormwater utility? We say we know a little bit about regulatory conditions, but what do we do about it? A stormwater utility is like any other public service utility, though it's a little more nebulous in nature. People understand when electricity is run to their house and they turn their water on and water comes out of a faucet, it's very direct, whereas stormwater is more diffuse in its and more interdisciplinary in its demands and how it is managed. But it provides the ability to fund the control and treatment of stormwater through a municipal stormwater program for maintenance, improvements, planning, regulatory issues, permitting, and administrative functions that it takes to implement this permit. And funds generated from utility are maintained in a separate fund that is dedicated and protected for the purpose of that program. So a utility it creates revenue, it creates that source of revenue, it creates a flexible rate structure that can be modified if needed or and help meet the demands of the community. It can create structure and problem-solving ability for stormwater, for like aging infrastructure, development pressures, hopefully no lawsuits, helps address environmental issues, and meets those regulatory demands. And those regulatory demands, there are other regulations percolating at the federal level that are even more stringent than this. And of course, we want something that we are working on to benefit people and for people to understand how it helps. But how our compliance manifests is not necessarily readily visible if you were just walking down the street. It can be a little bit harder to understand. It's very labor intensive, but not highly visible. It includes inspections, water quality testing, but we do want to have ways for people to participate in the program. We're required to have community education and outreach, which was the only thing we scored very high in our audit. And we are interested in developing a drainage assistance program of some kind to be able to help people with guidance and understanding of how to maintain their own properties to mitigate stormwater issues. Citizens will have increased support to respond to stormwater complaints, investigations of illicit discharges and connections, and over time they may experience less nuisance flooding and overall improved conveyance of stormwater as infrastructure issues are addressed, especially those larger projects such as right-sizing stormwater pipes under downtown as an example. I think it's mentioned in a couple other slides, but I can't emphasize it enough that managing people's expectations is very important and very difficult. You know, a utility is not a silver bullet. It's not going to stop flooding from happening. It's very associated with that water quality, which may, by extension, also can improve localized flooding issues that may be the result of pipes being too small or ditching not being sufficient or things of that nature. But when we have 6 inches of rain in 2.5 hours, there's next to nothing you can do. Those are flood conditions, and we can't stop flood conditions. These are some examples of basic municipal stormwater activities: improving stormwater planning and watershed management, culvert repairs, street sweeping, and catch basin cleaning, flood reduction and protection programs, stream bank erosion restoration. We are mobilizing next week down at Veterans Park. We're super excited about that project. Leaf litter pickup, public education and outreach. We have a rain barrel workshop getting ready to happen. We did a live stake workshop a couple months ago. Mapping of the network, SCMs, and other asset management efforts. Illicit discharge detection and elimination programs, dry outfall testing and wet weather testing. These are required programs of the permit. Site inspections and operation maintenance of public facilities. We have to inspect our town sites on a regular basis and report to the state any findings and improvements we have to make there. Hard infrastructure improvements such as adding to the MS4 and upsizing existing MS4. Maintenance of existing and new stormwater practices, water quality monitoring, data collection, analysis, and reporting. Every year at the end of your permit, you do a fiscal analysis. Every year at the end of your permit, you self-audit every element of your program and make note of improvements you will make to be on target. Of course, there are always some pros and cons to consider when you're thinking about something new. A pro of a utility is that it creates revenue without increasing a tax rate. It reduces a burden on the general fund. It's more equitable than just an across-the-board property tax increase. It's stable and predictable. It's dedicated and protected, and can be flexible to meet the needs of the program. Some difficulties can be potential negative perception, increased expectations from citizens about stormwater and flood prevention, which may not be totally related to the regulatory needs or at all preventable. And additional staff resources are required to operate a compliant stormwater program in the associated utility. So in North Carolina, this number has ticked up a little bit in the last year, but the last time Environmental Finance surveyed, there were 88 stormwater utilities in the state. 80 of those were municipal. The others, I think one is UNC Chapel Hill, one is DOT, and one may be an airport. I'm not sure. And of the North Carolina MS4 communities, with the utility, 88 of the MS4 communities have a utility, 23 do not. So in addition to considering a utility, stormwater funding opportunities can come from other places in combination with or separate from the general fund, grants, bonds, special taxing districts. In large cities, when you have very large industrial areas, sometimes you will see that used. Special assessments, utility, loans and debt. Staff is recommending a utility. How do you establish one of these? We tried really hard to engage in doing the research and setting up the structure for this to mitigate cost for the town as much as possible. So moving forward is everything that any revenue generated can go right into the utility and not pay a consultant $100,000 to do what we do in the next few slides. A stormwater utility is suggested in the 2010 Stormwater Master Plan. It is also called for in the town's comprehensive plan, and it's done by ordinance. And there is a draft of that ordinance for you to look over. And how we engage in starting points through data collection, permit requirements, local ordinances, conducting that internal audit, findings from the DEQ audit. We look at system metrics like the boundary, parcel and land use information, collect available data on the MS4, and then a financial analysis, comparative analysis of similar MS4 communities, explain the fiscal constraints for compliance and service, and then explore rate structures and collection methods. Out of the sake of curiosity, I surveyed some of the MS4 communities, and 14 of them responded, 2 of those being in our area, and 86% said that the level of funding they had currently could not meet their needs. This supports UNC Environmental Finance Center report, which shows increases happening across the state in stormwater fees, some as much as 20%. And then talked about meeting those expectations again. We'll be closer to meeting the demands of the permit, but that may not meet the demands of the community. And they just might not line up perfectly. Incidentally, in this budget season, I've seen many stormwater fees going up in the 3 to 5% just in this next year. Summary of existing financial resources and staff. Minimum staff requirements. Due to the wide variety of organization, structure, and accounting methods, there is not a precise way to understand what we have for stormwater right now. So we can't exactly compare ourselves very easily to other communities. I can't say I have this many dedicated staff or this. But I did look at 6 communities who have similar population sizes who also hold this permit. And of them, they had 2 to 6 full-time employees in the field doing just stormwater maintenance, testing, monitoring, inspections, and they each had between 1 and 5 full-time administrative and program support staff. We don't have any dedicated staff. We are absorbing this with existing staff. It's integrated into a lot of our work, but we don't have set aside. If we move forward, we're going to need more staff, particularly the stormwater utility could fund a stormwater tech position, and that person would be doing facility inspections, responding to complaints, and dealing with many of the items in that permit that are related to the inspections of inlets and outfalls, investigating illicit discharges, responding to complaints from the public, communicating with Buncombe County Soil and Erosion Control as needed. They monitor high-risk areas, particularly right at the river for illicit discharges from industrial areas. They have to conduct dry weather outfall monitoring, because when you go out periodically on a required schedule when there has not been rain within 72 hours, and to see if anything is coming out of the outfalls. And if it is, you have to test it, and then you have to figure out where it's coming from. So it's a lot of work in the field. In the 2010 Stormwater Management Plan, there are many large capital projects called for. And we saw a wetland that was supposed to cost $86,000, improvements to downtown infrastructure, which was referred to as the West Basin, at nearly $500,000. Downtown.
Yes,
Yep.
pause just a moment. What is the 86,000 bioretention wetland? Is that one site or is that several sites?
That's one site.
project, One site.
One
Where
site.
would that be located?
I don't remember where that was.
Is there
Mayor
Lake
Harris
Tomahawk?
in that plan.
Near Lake Tomahawk,
It could have
I
been.
think.
We could pull that plan and look at it, but these come straight out of that 2010 plan.
Uh-huh.
but I can't recall exactly where that location was. We could get that
Oh.
information.
No, it was across the street from Jamie's building. It was down across the street from Public Works.
Okay.
There are some some projects in that plan that have been lost in the last few years because of property sales and
right.
whatnot. But these are 2010 dollars.
Right.
Um,
It's across the street from the Black Mountain Avenue
mhm.
facility?
It's on private property.
Really? I'm trying
If
to
you go
think.
down there and look at that parking lot across from us,
Uh-huh.
that water continuously runs out from under that wall all summer.
But it's the parking lot?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay.
Well, one of these projects actually was showing, and it may have been the east, maybe in one of those basins, but it was showing the entire area where the hotel is.
Oh, that one's out. That was a Riparian Park.
Okay, so obviously that can't be done now.
The West Bay, which one was that, West Basin?
That's downtown, and then East Basin is actually behind this building, down under Ridgeway
Is
and
that
whatnot.
right sizing all the
There's
drainage and
no,
stuff?
yes, and
primarily?
adding more. I think it calls for 72-inch culverts.
Yeah, I have to look at that again.
But
yes,
it's the
It's new
drainage.
infrastructure. These are hard infrastructure projects for the most part. You do see some wetlands in there. But when I originally did this, that $35,000 was before we saw the construction and the inflation that we're experiencing right now. I do not know what those look like in 2021 and onward dollars, but they are much more than that.
Sure.
So the utility would also support programming, which meets the requirements of the permit, the education and outreach. We often get calls from people, I mean, every time it rains more than about an inch, somebody's calling saying, help me, help me, help me. And I have to say, I can't help. And we can direct them to resources and give them recommendations of folks to talk to. But given our topography, our soil types, and the velocity of the water that moves through, it could benefit the town and the property owners in the future to have potential, whether conveyance improvements on easement on private property to connect to the actual system, because water doesn't follow the rules. It doesn't go where we want it to go. That's just an option. There are many cities in the state who have programs like this, and how that would really take shape still needs more discussion. Public education outreach is not just having workshops, but we are required to have target audiences and provide specific information to specific water quality issues to those audiences. And in our permit, we list, residents, tourists, business owners, the industrial community, contracting community, schools, different communities who have to be communicated with in individual ways and on their own frequencies. They also want to see collaboration with community organizations, relationships with media campaigns, to get out just stormwater awareness information. We have to provide metrics on all of this. We have to report how many pieces of mail we sent out, and we have to give them a copy of it. If we send out a flyer on our building permits for tips on maintaining your stormwater runoff, I have to say how many times we did that. Here's a copy of it. It's all reported. So there are a lot of cost factors to consider. IDDE is really one of the more expensive ones, and one of the higher risk ones because it is associated with the age of the infrastructure. We also need more mapping and inventory of that system so we can conduct investigations. We have to be proactive in responding to IDDE complaints. We have a hotline for that. We need equipment and training to detect those discharges and identify those sources. There's some really interesting equipment out there to do dye testing and smoke testing, little cameras on wheels that you can send through the system to try to find where it's coming from. The weather outfall, the dry weather monitoring, you're going out there and you're doing water testing and you're testing what's coming out of those pipes. Actual repairs to that system found in regular monitoring. response tracking base. Everything has to be documented. If somebody calls and they've got bubbles coming out of their ditch, we have to track that entire thing, just like any, like a police case or a zoning violation or anything else. We have to have employee training on IDDE, and that is something we are implementing. So every staff is really responsible for being an extra set of eyes. I don't expect a police officer to go figure out why something's coming out of a pipe, but if he sees something concerning, I hope he will call me and we'll get on it. Post-construction program, we have to understand the number of projects that are reviewed, the types and the ages, annual inspection and enforcement actions. We maintain the GIS database of those SCMs. We have to make sure that they are following their O&Ms with the county and enforcement actions as required. We have to update the ordinance as state and federal rules change around post-construction. We have to manage this post-construction permits and coordinate and approve with our consulting civil engineer who looks at all of those for us. This is one of the bigger items that sounds easy in the permits prevention. We have to have stormwater prevention plans for all town facilities. So I wrote standard operating procedures for all facilities. We have to have, I wrote a spill prevention program in response, and we brought spill kits. We'd have to do annual training. We do street sweeping. That's good. Catch basin clean out and equipment and labor. When a inlet is cleaned out, you can't just say we cleaned out this inlet on State Street. You have to say what came out of it and how much of it there was. So, and you do get to choose your metric by volume, by weight. We did call around about vacuum trucks just to learn about what resources were available. Jennifer, can you help me remember, were they $12,000 a week to rent a service?
Something along those lines.
And about $40,000 for a month. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think we need that very often, or we don't know how much we would need because we don't have that data. But as opposed to one of Jamie's guys out there, literally shoveling by hand silts full of hydrocarbons and whatnot out of the catch basin. Vacuum trucks come in and very readily do it, but they are extremely expensive. Maintenance, I don't want this to sound like we aren't doing any maintenance, but we have to account for all of our maintenance. We have to prove it. We have to monitor it and do more. Routine maintenance of our SCMs, outfalls, inlets, the pipes, the culverts, and the open ditching, responding to work orders for repair. There are technology requirements around this. Developing maintenance schedules and inspection checklists. The state is so generous. They did provide some checklists recently, which we have downloaded. We have to make a differentiation between routine and long-term inspections and maintenance activities. So there are some things we need to do on a regular, more routine schedule, but there are some things that only need to happen every other year or need to happen. This part of the town happens in this year, this part of the town happens the next year. So it's always happening, but in rotating in different geographic sections. And adjusting to meet the appropriate level of service for compliance and community needs. This program is in some ways very fixed because we have regulatory demands, but there's also the community aspect where we want these to line up as much as we can. And so that is going to be not a moving target, but will be adjusted as community needs are made more obvious and demonstrated in specific areas. The evaluation is extensive with the sampling. When we have wet weather, we have to do high-risk areas. We have to look for water stressors on our impaired waters. The Swannanoa River is an impaired surface water. We have to develop those measurable and trackable goals for all elements of the permits, more than 50 items. Make the annual reports, maintain tracking system for all of the permit requirements. We have to go through a pre-audit process. And every 5 years, we have to go through the audit process, though I did notice that they have put us on the short list, and we could be audited again as soon as 2022. I don't know if they are going to do that, given the delay in getting our stormwater management plan approved. but that is the last Excel document from the state. So there are also lots of things that drive the cost of compliance in making this work. There's no methodology right now to say it generally costs about this much to come into compliance. I've personally started a little statistics project to see if I can make some of those. That's going to take me a little bit of time to get all that data entered. But we do know that Greenville was compliant, and they spend or invest $63.78 per capita. And Clemens spends $112.95 per capita. So if you apply that just to our population, somewhere the budget would be between $540,000 and $950,000. That's just food for thought. It's not so much, that is not founded in math yet. And there's stormwater utility trends across the state. I think the number that's been established since 2018 is now up to 5. You were seeing more and more municipalities look to establishing a utility since we all got audited. And people realized that these programs really need a lot of funding. In 2018, 13 existing utilities raised their rates. And the standard deviation increased from $1.40 to $2.60 since 2010. So that spread really increased. And there's just a note that in this year, we're seeing even more increases in rates. The local factors that influence our program costs are land uses, median income, population, level of service, existing impervious cover, soil types, existing SEMs, existing capacity of the stormwater system, existing age, the program capacity, existing staff, and existing technology. So this is where we get into a rate analysis. In order to establish a utility, you have to have some founding of how you are going to establish a rate. You can't just make it up. And I talked to some consultants about this service, and they told me what you do, and I thought, yeah, we can figure that out. And that's the culmination of this entire PowerPoint. We have a challenge in doing a traditional rates analysis because we do not have old data to look at. We don't have records saying, we have some records, but not complete records of saying, we spent this much money on this activity and this activity, or in this many man hours. So kind of put it together best we could. Not having all the known location and condition of MS4 makes it difficult to wrap our head around what those costs really are. And our master plan is outdated, so we don't really know now what it would cost to make these improvements. There are 3 types of rate structures you can consider in a utility. You can have a flat rate, and that's just everybody pays the same thing. You can have a flat tiered rate, which is the staff recommended method, which is to have tiers associated with intensity. Or you can have equivalent residential units, which is an equation of impervious surface per parcel. And that is certainly the most equitable way to do it. It is also the most labor intensive and the most expensive. I think that could be a goal in the future, but I think that it would be a hard starting point.
Excuse me, can you clarify what intensity of use means?
Yes. So a 3-bedroom house, regular size house versus Ingalls. One creates more stormwater than the other. And so we're looking at the potential to generate a volume of stormwater and also a potential to create pollution in stormwater. Like a very large parking lot has the ability to make a lot of water pollution because of the oil on the surface that runs with it compared to your yard. Does that make sense?
Sure. And is there kind of guidance or standards for what those tiers would look like?
I'm going to share some with you that I proposed, but they are up to the individual. You can set them up however you wish as a municipality. There are also a couple of different ways you can do the billing. Standalone billing is what staff is recommending. It would be on an annual cycle. We have software that can generate those invoices. And in this way, the town maintains custody of all records and payment and devotes as much revenue as possible to actual compliance and not outsourcing things. It also allows the town to be able to deal with folks who have non-payment, whereas if we do something like the county cannot go through those processes on the town's behalf without special legislation, if I remember correctly. Is that right? Okay. And it was also going to be extremely expensive to get started with the county and the fees associated with their providing that service for us. We hoped water bills would be the solution and just send it out that way, but not everybody in town has town water, and we don't have records of every well because the county did not keep well records until like the early 80s or late 70s. So, and we can't just not let them pay the fee. So the easiest way to do it is through a standalone billing cycle. So environmental finance publishes fantastic data on stormwater utilities in the state. And I looked at towns that had similar populations, and some of them are also towns with a lot of tourism or some sort of unique stormwater condition like the beach. Very different from the mountains, but a unique stormwater condition that costs more to deal with. In Western North Carolina, there are two utilities, and that is Asheville and Hendersonville. And just for reference, about per capita, Asheville is spending about $71 and Hendersonville is spending about $40. So this is just some information of these comparison communities to the town of Black Mountain. Populations up at the top, area in square miles, number of dwelling units, median income, and then you can see how they're doing their fee structures. Some are doing flat, some are doing flat tiered. And I think that this is pretty common among smaller municipalities. It looks like larger municipalities with larger programs are the ones who are moving toward the ERUs. Their method of collection varies, and the revenue varies. We have 256 down at Butner, with over $1.5 million at Carolina Beach. So I did not have data available to know what other revenues that they are collecting, to fund their stormwater programs, but this is their approximate revenues from their utilities alone. So these are the number of dollars expended a stormwater per capita from those like towns. And you can see the town over on the right with those different rates considered, which you'll see in a minute. But it puts us very in line with those similar communities. On average, a residential property served by a stormwater utility right now in North Carolina is $6.68 per month. And this is just the distribution across the state of stormwater rates. You can see they can get pretty high. So we want our structure to be based in some sort of rationale. We don't want to just, pick a number out of thin air. So we are making the following recommendations based on an assessment that your operational needs, that your rate should be linked to your operational needs to comply comprehensive service delivery and to fund future capital projects, estimated over $15 million. And secondary to this rate, we're looking at those similar sized communities who are achieving compliance or have longer established programs. And are we kind of following in that range? Are we in line with them? So from a historical perspective, the town has been operating a stormwater program technically over a decade. We've been providing stormwater services for much longer, but under NPDES permit. And the best number I could come up with was $114,000. That I'm not going to say it's super accurate, but it was the best we could do, looking at work orders, man hours, and things like that. For strictly meeting and operating, not capital needs, the current annual budget needed to fully address regulatory requirements, but also increase service delivery for infrastructure maintenance is probably close to $500,000. But we're not really going to know until we get in there and we do this for some years and see.
Some of these numbers are just outrageous.
Oh, I know.
I mean, the town can't afford that. What do you do with that?
I don't have an answer for that.
No, I know you don't. I mean, I know it's not, but these numbers are not manageable. They're just not manageable. We can start, I mean, we all know where we're gonna start and so forth, with a reasonable number. But, to think that you're gonna, we have what we're spending, it's kind of hard to come up, but I'd buy your $100,000 number with what Jamie's, crew is currently doing and what we do. But to think about to think about $500,000, I mean, that's you can do the arithmetic. You're talking, increasing the tax rate by, 10 cents, 15 cents for stormwater management. I just don't think our citizens can, certainly some can, but, on the whole, we're not gonna be able to afford that.
I think that in a couple of years, we will have a better idea of where we're sitting. We may have more money being invested already and be closer to that number than we think,
I could buy
but
that.
we don't have
Don't know.
the tracking to support it. And that's one of the reasons, if we move forward with the utility, we're going to have to track what comes in and also what's already being done and reconcile those into being the full stormwater effort. That's going to take some accounting that we're still figuring out how to set those systems up.
Once assuming the council, moves forward to form a utility, I think that will help in itself as far as accounting for things, because you'll end up moving some things from public works. And I would think it's a considerable amount.
I think it is too. Our tracking of, there are so many things that really relate to stormwater that are not necessarily thought of as stormwater, like street sweeping is a stormwater requirement. But we're not tracking those dollars as stormwater compliant dollars. And so it's going to be an effort of capturing all of that information and what happens in the utility in reconciling that.
So what's Public Works annual budget?
Oh, man.
Jamie, you remember off the top of your head?
You got so many departments, I
But
can't
then,
remember.
but let's just say that then $1 million of that, your staffing is water.
23, I got 23 and 40.
But I mean, your personnel cost, we're allocating 50% of that to the water.
Oh, yeah.
So I'd almost take, and some of the stuff going on in water, probably,
It might.
some of it's slipping back, could certainly be. So, my guess is that when we start, again, it may take a couple of years, but when you start pulling it apart for accounting purposes, it may not be, as off the mark as it is. But if we're talking new dollars, it's problematic.
Well, a lot of the new dollars are necessary for a lot of these permit requirements that have simply not occurred. We have never done IDDE program at all.
That's what the new staff person.
That the person would be largely responsible for that. We haven't had, it's all this water quality testing, monitoring. It would be mapping those assets, knowing the condition, and maintaining those. We do maintenance on the MS4, but when you start mapping your assets, you're going to say, well, we have a gap here, and we're going to improve the MS4 by making this connection over here. But we also know that we have more than $15 million of hard infrastructure needs. And that's going to be something that over time it's got to be funded. And the utility dollars, they can be used, and set aside for capital projects. They can also be used as debt service for large capital projects, just kind of however you want to use them. So they're flexible as long as they go toward that need. But the infrastructure here is your huge driving cost. I mean, it is very expensive. You also want to be kind of thinking of two questions when you're considering a rate. Does it fully support the operations, maintenance, and repair, replacement upgrades to the existing and future debt service, capital investment, or anticipated regulatory changes? And does the rate provide adequate operating revenue for compliance, debt service if needed, and necessary allocations for future infrastructure? So it's just, you can't say, well, I just think that one's good. You kind of have to say, does this actually generate enough revenue to make a good effort to being compliant? I guess. So given the high demands of the permit and the lack of implementation so far, we're really behind on working on the hard infrastructure, you need to be very cognizant of how you consider the rate in relationship to those high infrastructure demands. So we went with the tiered rate just to put it out there for something to consider. Using a flat tiered rate, every parcel must be assigned a category. That's the scariest Excel document you've ever seen. But we used tax data and zoning information. We also did some 2020 GIS aerials and some drive-by to try to get as close as we could to parcel assignment. There will be some that are wrong. If we move forward, everybody will have an opportunity to appeal their designation. They will get a form with their first invoice, and it will say, if you think that this is not right, fill this out and we will fix it. So tiered 1 are your minimal impacts, that's single family and multifamily up to less than 4 units. Moderate impacts 2, which is non-residential, your retail, office, and multifamily with greater than 4. Tier 3 are undeveloped land. Tier 4 are exempt. Those are just government properties. We can't compel the state to pay for anything, or the federal government, so that's why that's exempt. And tier 5 are your heavy impacts, which are your larger, either very large areas of impervious surface or industrial, things where you have more runoff potential. Tier 1 represents 70% of all parcels in Black Mountain, and it represents 79% of all parcels subject to the stormwater utility fee. And I think that's very important to understand because we have such a lack of diversity in land uses that it actually drives up the burden on residential parcels compared to what could be borne by a town that has a greater diversity. If you had more retail areas or greater industrial areas, more of that stormwater budget would be borne by them. And this is just a little clip from the Excel spreadsheet where you can see the tier is that second column. And then there's this, I have the state average and then the proposed residential rates of $6, $5, $4, $3, and $2. And all of that runs for nearly 5,000 parcels. And I can use that down at the bottom. I also use this same database to track how much green space is in town and how many parcels are not developed yet, how many things are retained in green space, how much land percentage is, available for development. It's all in one place. So
May I ask, where are we in?
We're almost.
we're almost done.
We're almost at the end.
I know it's a lot, and I'm sorry. It's just a lot of
It's a
information.
lot and it's more than people can absorb, but we know we need to start, so that's fine, we get it.
So we have some rate scenarios for you to look at, and the highest represents 88% of the state average, and the lowest represents 29% of the state average. Scenario 1 puts $6 a month for residential, $25 for non-residential, and $100 on intense. In all scenarios, undeveloped and exempt properties obviously have 0, and then they just tier down from there. So we look at most around 370, maybe to 390, depending on how much development occurs in the next little bit, down to $150,000. And those are starting points and information for you to consider. And with understanding that there will be some shift in what parcels are assigned when people actually have an opportunity to
Well,
correct.
you have this up, your recommendation is 5,
My recommendation is 6.
6.
And the budget that I provided for you is based on 6.
This is a little bit higher because I ran numbers of our most, or how many building permits have been approved since we did this, and that's reflected in the budget.
So just to go back, the non-moderate, non-residential, well, is it a flat fee for, say, the Ingalls Distribution Center and the little store?
No, that would be an intense use. Ingalls would be an intense use. Your moderate is more like apartment buildings, banks, retail stores.
Uh-huh. But the whole, it's not pertinent to square footage or anything.
It's not. You could create additional tiers, and I modeled this several different ways. But this was the most concise. You don't see many tiered rates beyond 4, 5, 6 levels. You could create small, moderate, large, moderate. You could decide to break that down further if you wanted to.
I see. Thank you.
These are the categories of a stormwater budget. We have staff administration, capital outlay, maintenance, education and outreach, and then the green infrastructure. That's what it looks like when we break it out by category. You see that I really was trying to get to a third going into capital. Almost there. I think the first year budget would be a little skewed because of this, mobilizing, getting equipment and things. An example of an early project, hard infrastructure is great and it takes a long time to see. And if people are going to be asked to pay a fee, we want to make sure that they're seeing things as quickly as possible so that we are having smaller scale projects of green infrastructure as well as planning for the harder infrastructure. And this is a retrofit at Black Mountain Interior Estates. We actually have a grant in right now to pay for half of this. In total, it's about $130,000 project. And this is called for in the Stormwater Master Plan. And so this is just an example of something that could happen within the first year of the utility being established. And that's just an example of all of the environmental improvements that one retrofit would make as far as total loads being discharged into the river. So in the draft ordinance, we do make a provision about future credit programs, which would influence the budget, but we do not know to what extent yet. Potential use of ERUs, we can continue to update the program. We want to be aware of responding to regulatory demands and the potential rate increase or just adjustments over time, depending on what we learn on the existing program and what regulatory changes come down to us. So we are recommending that we establish a stormwater utility in a dedicated fund, utilizing a tiered flat rate, issuing an annual fee to be handled by existing staff, and then we implement the requirements of the NPDES permit as described by the stormwater management plan approved by the state. And that's it.
Good, thank you. That's a lot of work. I know. Thank you.
And I know it's a lot to absorb, but I would not want to come in here and say, I think we need to deal with big budget numbers without explaining why.
Absolutely. And the presentation in total is available to the public online.
It absolutely will be.
It's there now, or it will.
It will be.
It's actually on there now. It was added this morning. The
Yeah,
slides are there.
yeah. I mean, no, all the information has to be there, and it's good. I mean, you had to do what you did, so it's all good. Council, open it up to you for questions to Jessica. So your first year budget, should council, move in this direction, let's just call it $400,000. And so, roughly half of that then is the staff and expenses. It's basically you're setting up starting an operation there. The other 200 allocated starting to compile some capital for projects.
My goal would hopefully be to have at least $100,000 available to hard capital projects in whatever method you wanted to use it, whether you wanted to allocate it into a set-aside account for the future, or if you wanted to use it as debt service, or grant match, or whatever.
Well, you know, it'll be up to council and budget,
Mhm.
but I would think, initially, you might just want to get your feet underneath you, you know, and set it aside for capital projects, and then, and see, and just get a handle on what, it's sort of difficult for me to know how to allocate with these incredible costs and so forth, $100,000.
I don't think it would, I think you're right that it makes sense to allocate that into the future. I mean, one of the things that we budget for in the first year is updating that stormwater master plan.
Right.
So we really know where we're landing and we have updated numbers and we know what we're up against.
Right. Well, do you have to, is that something you need to pay a consulting? firm
An
to
engineering
do?
firm.
Well, so that's some of your 100,000
It-
there.
It's actually
You've got that in the
budgeted.
budget?
It's in
It's in
there, professional services.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, but anyway, it's, the numbers are so massive, and I do think that, the projects that were, you know, that were in the comprehensive plan, that those haven't been, you know, they kind of need to be revisited
Mhm.
and numbers placed on them. You know, all that in the first year when you've got somebody that can do it, but we need to get a little bit of handle, and then also prioritizing, because you just can't do that.
No.
I mean, you have to, obviously it has to be spread out, but, and you may not be able to answer this, but what would be, in your assessment, because you're probably closer to it than anybody else, if you had to say, this is the most impact, it doesn't matter how expensive it is, I'm just guessing it's probably the downtown, you know, all the upfitting of all the culverts and so forth downtown, that's where all the money was in the
I do
comprehensive
think
plan.
that I do think the stormwater master plans call for upfitting downtown is a high priority. I do also think that we have areas on the peripheral of downtown where we do not have any, we do not have a basin connecting. So it's, we're very dependent on the surface water conveyance to the river, where it would be much safer and we would actually move a lot more water more effectively if we had that network expanded. And those are in there, those are included in the existing stormwater master plan.
One of them must be right here on Monterey Road.
It may be.
But anyway, I think that's the important, I mean, those are some of the things that, you know, when we have a staff person that can, you know, has the time to get, you know, I think it would be helpful, to, you know, and you covered a good bit of this, but we're asking the public to, asking's not the right word, but we're saying this is essential, it's important, it's thrust upon us, we don't really have a choice.
Mhm.
But then, with that though, to help explain, you know, immediately what we're planning on doing, which you did a good bit today, but you're looking at it from 10,000 feet and you're looking at $20 million and, you know, whatever, it's too massive a change. And it's also really a change in how we're doing business now, because Public Works, as you said, is, you know, all those monies are wound in and out of it, almost everything that Jamie does, and even in water to a certain extent, probably, except for actually delivering the water and all that stuff. So, you know, we almost have a year or two in front of us just to get organized and know what we're doing and how we're going to move forward with expenditures. And I'm sort of curious with some of these larger projects, and we may have opportunity, you know, with the funds coming in. And with that, we can get that, you know, you don't have forever to spend those monies.
Mhm.
And so let's just say, for example, that council said of the 2.4 million that we're getting, let's address stormwater. Let's address some of these issues.
Mhm.
With some of these projects that we know are important. What would we do with, let's say, $750,000?
Mhm.
I mean, how would you deploy that?
I really think
Good
that
question.
we would have to bring in the engineers from the
Yeah,
stormwater master
right,
plan to
right.
say, this is a finite amount of money. We need as much bang for our buck as possible with it.
Right.
Which would you do? Because, some of these projects are many millions of
Oh,
dollars.
sure.
But, that would be nothing to sneeze at. So,
It's a thought,
Yeah.
it's something that's really, I mean, it's gonna be on us soon,
mhm,
and it's gonna be a problem for everybody.
mhm,
It's a problem for almost all the projects. We have some that are more, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a great deal of specificities to some of the projects that we have that aren't stormwater related. And I think that's the issue, that some of the stormwater projects downtown, it's what, $4 or $5 million or whatever it is, those numbers, and those are old numbers. Well, what if, what's the key? Where do you start? What's the one place you address and then build from there and so forth? Like you said, that takes the engineering to do it.
mhm.
But, I think in this first year, and with these monies coming in, that, that's just gonna have to be a priority, I think,
Mhm.
if we're gonna use any for stormwater, and it would be great if we could.
It
So
would be.
anyway.
And we do have, I showed the retrofit down at Black Mountain Avenue. Projects like that, or even a few of the projects like that would be in that price range. And
Mhm.
some of the benefit of those, they do have immediate water quality improvements and local, like hyper-localized, like nuisance flooding improvements. But they're also very visible
Yeah.
and people can see them and understand how they work as opposed to putting a pipe underground, which doesn't necessarily translate as, we got something, we're seeing what we wanted. So those visible projects can be helpful at the beginning.
If I could say something about the project overall, stormwater too, John Beck, the land guy, a few years ago, me and him walked and tried to match some of that stuff for our GIS and did what we did with our own knowledge. But the stormwater as a whole, and I tell you this from experience, if you're gonna do a project, you better make sure you got the funding to complete that project, because I know a lot of stuff we do in town with water or big projects, we do it in years, like 2 or 3 years. Stormwater can't be done that way because when you start on a system, that system's the same age. And you can't replace half of it this year and half of it next year, because if you replace the upstream side and make it new, you're gonna blow the downstream side behind the ground. And when we replaced the section behind the town hardware years ago, that exact thing happened, and it blew the pipe out under Harry Hyder's building and everything downstream. So if we do a project, we need to make sure we got the funding to complete
The length of
every
it.
project at one at a time. We can't have those projects, they gotta be complete.
Those new pipes at their sizes can take on such a volume of water that they put too much pressure, on the older infrastructure.
The one you mentioned on Montgomery Road, it crosses there at First Baptist,
Mhm.
comes down to Fifth Third, actually goes to the corner of, the fire department, goes down, gets to the parking lot right there, the new parking lot at Town Square, goes under 70, goes under the post office. And if you walk to the back of the post office and look where it goes under, it's pretty scary looking. So, there's definitely some issues under the building. And the one I was talking to prior about Town Square, it comes across from, Church Street, and it has a live stream right there. Now, whether, that would be something determined by, when they test the water, whether it's groundwater or if it is a live stream. And then you got a whole nother round of things where, what are they gonna require you to do, if there's any aquatic life in it, or, I mean, it's crazy the criteria that they put in all this stuff.
So I think what's before council today is this would end up being part of our budget. But there's two things going on, maybe more than two. But one is budgeting. This would be this utility fund, should council move in this direction, would be part of the 21-22 budget, but then we need to pass a stormwater ordinance.
Stormwater utility ordinance, and then, which you have a stormwater utility ordinance and a stormwater utility fund, both for public hearing at the June meeting.
Right, right.
But you don't have to set
You
the
don't have
rate
to
at
set
that
the
time.
rate
You can
now.
do that at budget.
Yeah, the budget would be, I mean, the rate would be set in the budget.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So does the board need to take any action today or just be prepared to do that at the public hearing next month?
What do you think, Aaron?
I don't think there's any action for you to take tonight. You've already called for the public hearing, and
Yeah.
so you're, I think this was just informational today to make sure that you didn't wind up with an hour-long presentation
Right.
during that public hearing. or
Right.
regular meeting.
Right,
And you're certainly, please, if you have questions, just let me know.
Yeah.
I've got, this was 95 slides. We got it down.
That's a lot of
There's
stuff.
more there.
I will also just mention, because I don't know if council has seen the actual draft ordinance yet. I'm sure that'll be coming to you before the next meeting. But the utility is set up to bill once per year to the owner of the property, of each property in town as of January 1st. So the person who's responsible for payment for the year is the owner as of January 1st, similar to the way that tax bills are done. If you've got a real estate transaction, the parties will prorate that between them. And then there is I think Jessica mentioned a section for exemptions or credits. And those credits, that credit portion program won't be effective for 3 years. I think we've set that out to 2020. Well, 2 years, 2023, I think is.
Because it will create a new administrative burden that we
Right.
don't want to have on the top.
So just 2 things to note. Also, the statutes allow, once you have this enterprise fund set up, you can receive grants into that fund. If you decide to levy some sort of special assessment at some point for capital improvements, that could go into this fund. If you decided to do a bond, that could go into the fund. And so you in addition to establishing the utility, you come away with some other tools in your tool belt for how you can address some of those capital needs. And then I will just say, as a kind of a point of institutional knowledge, when the stormwater permit was first done in around 2009, I think it was, shortly after that, there was a capital needs assessment done here in town. Some of you know I was doing the minutes for the board of aldermen at the time, about a decade ago. And so I remember some of those. And I think at the time, the 2 things that struck me were, one, the system at the time could not handle a 25-year storm, let alone a 100-year storm. And Jessica mentioned how many of those we have had in the last 3 years. And at the time, the projected cost of all those needed capital improvements was around $8 million. So you can see in 10 years' time how much more expensive that has gotten. And so I would encourage the council to just be mindful of what that cost might look like 10 years from now, and what you can do to set up the town to be successful in that next 10 years, and be mindful of the cost of not complying, because those federal and state penalties at a rate of $60,000 a day potentially for not taking the steps to be in compliance, I think is a pretty serious consequence to just be mindful of.
council, any questions, comments?
One quick question, hopefully. You mentioned the reason we're talking about billing annually instead of monthly or tacking onto the water bills is because some people don't receive a water bill and we don't know who those people are. Is that
Some people have private wells.
right?
And we do not have a comprehensive list of who has a well, because wells were not always permitted through environmental health through the county. So we don't know who those are.
Yeah.
And doing it monthly as a standalone would be that would be a lot of fun, extra time and money
Sure.
done at staff level.
If you had, you have the mailing list that you would use to do the annual bill. And you have the water customers. You have the mailing list that you're gonna use to do the annual bill, and you have the water customers. Could you not get someone?
Look at the difference.
Yes.
Well, I don't know, I don't do water billings this
We
week.
sure can.
But there's also, I don't know, the way the ordinance is written, who the stormwater utility bill would go to, I think it may be different than who a water bill goes
It's
to.
gonna go to the owner of the
That's
property.
right.
We're going to compare the two, and if they're not on, if they're a water customer and they're on the,
Right.
they're on the list, they're a property owner, then they can, we can differentiate between the two. But I think what
Well, there's
Doug is
like,
getting at, it would be wonderful to be able to bill the water customers and they just pay $5 a month.
Yeah.
And then you send out the annual bill to
Right.
everybody else.
Oh,
It's a
that's
lot,
a-
it's a lot
that's a-
harder to stomach $72, randomly on a January that you're not anticipating than a couple
Yeah, I
dollars.
mean, we can definitely look at that, I think.
I think from a collections enforcement standpoint, it may be easier to have the annual bill and which system you choose to use to bill it. But to set it up so that it's due as of a later date in the year, similar to the way tax bills are done, so that the bills are issued, July 1st, but they're not delinquent until the end of the year.
right,
So that you allow people the opportunity to make monthly payments over the portion of the year. And you may think about that. My concern, I think, from the collections enforcement standpoint, is that if you have some of those that are going out with a water bill and some that are going out separately, and I fall behind on my water bill, and that means I'm also not paying my stormwater fee, are there enforcement penalties that attach to failing to pay the stormwater fee that are different than the water bill? And how those are then being tracked in collections by two different departments in town.
and when you have a water account as a renter, is that in your name, or is that different than the owner?
For the water, I'm a renter and the water bill's in my name.
So your stormwater bill that would go to the person who you rent from. So I think, and also so with apartment buildings, the owner of the apartment building gets charged a stormwater rate because of that, for that large, parcel,
Right.
as opposed to the 15
I
people.
understand. I understand, and
Yeah.
that's fine. I think what we wanted to do was try to make it convenient for our
Yes.
citizens.
Yes.
That was, I think, the mindset here. And I do understand that there can be some, just segregating the monies might be, it may be just as well to send out the annual bill. I do get that part of it. So, but it was our taxpayers that I think we were trying to be considerate of.
On a legal issue, if the water bill ain't paid, of course, we go out and shut the water off. So is it been followed just of what the penalty would be if it didn't get paid, or what would happen in that situation, or is that something
That's collection.
that we would
It
have?
goes to
It just
collections.
goes to collections.
Any other questions, comments? Again, Jessica, thank you for all your work. And is council, or does anybody have any concerns about moving forward? We're going to have the public hearing in June, but personally, we don't really have very much choice. We have to move forward. It's a good thing that we do. I think the challenge is just, it's kind of like, where do you, just sort of entering the process of actually starting to move forward with something that it's not that we haven't done it,
That's right.
but it hasn't really been set aside and focused on the way it should. And I think this will go a long ways toward that. I do think that that Tammy has a good bit of work to do to unwind and get some
Yes.
expenditures into
We've been
the
talking about it.
into the utility fund once established. And also the utility fund has there's going to have to be some indirect costs that are handled. And so you just got, there's a good bit there that, that needs to take place, I would think, for the budget, frankly. So if there's no other questions or comments, I think we've accomplished what we set out to do today. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.